winter of 1879, when contractors arrived to renovate the abandoned Sunset Years Christian home in Hartford, Connecticut, they discovered something that would haunt the city for decades. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the medical wing, wrapped in moth-eaten burial shrouds, lay 23 leather-bound ledgers containing the most meticulous records of systematic murder ever found in New England. Each page detailed names, dates, methods, and monetary gains from what investigators would later call the most calculated slaughter of innocents in American history. Dr. William Porter, his wife Margaret, and her sister Sarah had operated this Christian home for the elderly for 34 years. And according to these blood-stained records, they had methodically murdered 189 residents while stealing over $3 million in inheritances. The ledgers revealed a level of premeditation and greed so shocking that Hartford authorities suppressed the full details for nearly a century, fearing they would destroy the public's faith in Christian charity forever. Before we continue with the story of the Porter family and their house of horrors, I need to tell you something important. This channel isn't for everyone. Only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest secrets hidden in America's past. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here. Stories that reveal the true depths of human evil disguised as Christian charity. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You're one of the select few who can handle this dark mysteries. Subscribe now. Hit that notification bell and comment below telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know how far these stories reach our brotherhood of mystery hunters. Now, let's discover what really happened behind the sacred walls of the Sunset Years Christian home. But the true horror of the Porter family's crimes wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the methodical, almost loving way they documented each murder, as if they were proud of their work. Hartford, Connecticut in the 1840s was a city caught between its Puritan past and an uncertain industrial future. The Connecticut River brought prosperity through shipping and manufacturing, but it also brought a new kind of problem: wealthy elderly residents with no family to care for them. The old Puritan tradition of family responsibility was crumbling as young people moved west, leaving their aging parents behind with fortunes but no heirs. The Congregationalist churches that dominated Hartford's spiritual landscape had always emphasized charitable works, but the growing population of isolated elderly presented an unprecedented challenge. It was into this void that Dr. William Porter stepped in 1845, presenting himself as the answer to Christian Hartford's prayers. Dr. Porter was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to convey both wisdom and compassion. He had studied medicine at Yale and served as a field surgeon during the Mexican-American War, experiences that had given him an intimate knowledge of both healing and death. His wife Margaret was equally impressive, a trained nurse who had worked in Boston's charity hospitals before their marriage. Her sister Sarah completed their trinity of caretakers, a stern but seemingly devoted woman who had dedicated her life to Christian service after losing her husband to typhoid fever. Together they established the Sunset Years Christian home on Prospect Avenue, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been converted from a failed boarding house. The three-story building sat on 2 acres of manicured gardens, complete with a small chapel where residents could attend daily prayers. The Porters marketed their establishment as more than just a home for the elderly. It was a Christian sanctuary where the wealthy could spend their final years in comfort, surrounded by godly caretakers who would ensure their souls were prepared for the eternal journey ahead. The home's reputation spread quickly through Hartford's Congregationalist community. Reverend Samuel Whitmore of the First Church of Christ regularly recommended the Porters to parishioners struggling with elderly relatives. The cost was steep, $200 per month, more than most working families earned in a year. But for Hartford's merchant elite, it seemed a small price to pay for peace of mind. What made the Sunset Years Christian home particularly attractive was the Porters' willingness to accept residents regardless of their mental state. While other institutions turned away those showing signs of sility or confusion, the Porters welcomed them with open arms. Dr. Porter claimed to have developed revolutionary treatments for mental decline, combining Christian prayer with modern medicine to provide comfort in life's final chapter. The home's daily routine reflected its religious foundation. Residents woke at 6 a.m. for morning prayers in the chapel, followed by breakfast in the communal dining room. Dr. Porter conducted medical examinations each morning while Margaret supervised the nursing staff, and Sarah managed the home's financial affairs. Afternoon activities included Bible study, letter writing, and peaceful walks through the gardens. Evening prayers concluded each day with residents retiring to their private rooms by 9:00 p.m. From the outside, the Sunset Years Christian home appeared to be everything it claimed. A Christian oasis where the elderly could live out their final years in dignity and comfort. Visitors were always impressed by the cleanliness, the devoted staff, and the obvious contentment of the residents. What they couldn't see was the careful calculation behind every smile, every prayer, and every act of apparent kindness. The truth was that from the very beginning, the Porters had never intended to simply care for the elderly. They had created the perfect environment for something far more sinister. A place where wealthy, isolated individuals could be systematically exploited and murdered with no one to question their methods or mourn their victims. The first sign that something was terribly wrong at the Sunset Years Christian home came on a bitter February morning in 1847, though it would be decades before anyone understood its true significance. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a 73-year-old widow whose husband had made a fortune in the shipping trade, had been a resident for only 3 weeks when she began exhibiting troubling symptoms. According to the official records, Mrs. Thornton had been in excellent health when she arrived, complaining only of loneliness and mild arthritis. Her daughter lived in California, and her son had died in a carriage accident the previous year, leaving her completely alone with an estate worth nearly $50,000. She had chosen the Sunset Years Christian home, specifically because of its reputation for Christian compassion and medical expertise. But on that February morning, Margaret Porter found Mrs. Thornton in her room, barely conscious and mumbling incoherently about the angels coming to take her home. Her pupils were severely dilated, her breathing was shallow, and she seemed unable to recognize anyone around her. Dr. Porter was summoned immediately, and after a brief examination, he announced that Mrs. Thornton was suffering from a sudden decline in mental faculties, a condition he claimed to have observed frequently in elderly patients. What happened next established a pattern that would be repeated 188 more times over the following 32 years. Dr. Porter prescribed a strong dose of morphine to ease her suffering, explaining to the concerned staff that Mrs. Thornton was clearly experiencing great distress and that Christian mercy demanded they help her find peace. Margaret Porter administered the injection personally, and within hours Mrs. Thornton had slipped into a coma. For 3 days, Mrs. Thornton lingered between life and death, while the Porters maintained their vigil. They prayed over her constantly, held her hand, and spoke softly about the eternal rest that awaited her. To the staff and the few visitors who inquired about her condition, they presented themselves as devoted caretakers, doing everything possible to comfort a suffering soul. On the 4th day, Mrs. Thornton died peacefully in her sleep. The cause of death was listed as natural decline due to advanced age and mental deterioration, Dr. Porter being both the attending physician and the owner of the facility signed the death certificate himself. There was no autopsy, no investigation, and no questions asked by Hartford authorities. After all, death was an expected outcome in a home for the elderly. But what made Mrs. Thornton's death particularly significant was what happened in the days immediately following her passing. Sarah Porter, who handled all administrative matters for the home, approached the staff with a heartbreaking story. She explained that Mrs. Thornton, in her final moments of clarity, had expressed deep gratitude for the care she had received and had asked Sarah to ensure that her estate would be used to continue the home's Christian mission. Sarah produced a handwritten document supposedly dictated by Mrs. Thornton and witnessed by Dr. Porter and Margaret. In it, Mrs. Thornton left her entire estate to the Sunset Years Christian home, with the exception of a small bequest to her daughter in California. The document was written in Sarah's distinctive handwriting, but she explained that Mrs. Thornton had been too weak to write it herself and had asked Sarah to serve as her scribe. The supposed will was filed with the Hartford probate court, and since Mrs. Thornton had no local family to contest, the estate passed to the Porters without challenge. Within weeks, they had liquidated Mrs. Thornton's assets and deposited the proceeds into the home's accounts. The money was used to expand the facility, hire additional staff, and enhance the home's reputation as a premier Christian institution. To anyone observing from the outside, the entire sequence of events appeared perfectly normal. An elderly woman haddied peacefully in the care of devoted Christian caretakers, and in gratitude, She had left her estate to ensure that other elderly individuals could receive the same compassionate care. It was exactly the kind of Christian charity that Hartford's religious community expected and admired. But in the hidden ledgers that wouldn't be discovered for another 32 years, the truth was recorded in Dr. Porter's meticulous handwriting. Mrs. A. Thornton, morphine overdose administered February 15, 1847, inheritance secured, $47,300. Method refined for future subjects. Note: gradual introduction of morphine over several days creates appearance of natural decline. Staff suspects nothing. Community response positive. The ledgers revealed that Mrs. Thornton's death had been planned from the moment she arrived at the home. The Porters had carefully studied her financial situation, confirmed her lack of local family, and then systematically drugged her with small doses of morphine until she appeared to be suffering from mental decline. Once she was sufficiently incapacitated, they increased the dosage to fatal levels while maintaining the appearance of compassionate care. The forged will was just one part of their elaborate scheme. The Porters had studied Mrs. Thornton's handwriting, from letters in her possession, practiced reproducing her signature, and created a document that would pass casual inspection by probate authorities. They had even researched her daughter's situation in California, ensuring that the bequest was small enough to discourage her from traveling to Hartford to contest the will. What made their crime particularly chilling was the religious framework they used to justify and conceal their actions. By presenting themselves as devout Christians providing mercy to the suffering, they had created the perfect cover for systematic murder. Every injection of morphine was administered with prayers. Every forged document was presented as the dying wish of a grateful soul. And every stolen inheritance was justified as a gift to continue God's work. The success of their first murder convinced the Porters that they had discovered the perfect crime. They had proven that elderly people could be killed with impunity if the method was gradual enough and the religious justification was convincing enough. More importantly, they had demonstrated that massive inheritances could be stolen without arousing suspicion if the victims were isolated and the caretakers were trusted members of the Christian community. Mrs. Abigail Thornton's death wasn't just a murder. It was the first successful test of a system that would claim 188 more lives over the next 3 decades. And as Dr. Porter noted in his final entry about her case, method proven effective expansion of operations recommended. The Lord has provided us with a most profitable mission. The death of Mrs. Thornton marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated reign of terror that would continue for over 3 decades, though the full scope of the Porters' crimes wouldn't become apparent until much later. In the months following her death, the atmosphere of the sunset years, Christian home began to change in subtle but significant ways. Staff members noticed that Dr. Porter had become more selective about the residents he would accept. Where once he'd welcomed anyone who could afford the monthly fee, he now insisted on conducting extensive interviews, not just with potential residents, but with their families as well. He claimed this was to ensure that each resident would receive the most appropriate care for their specific needs. But his real purpose was far more sinister. The Porters had learned from their experience with Mrs. Thornton that successful murders required careful planning and the right type of victim. They needed residents who were wealthy, isolated, and vulnerable to manipulation. Most importantly, they needed people whose deaths would be accepted without question by the community. Margaret Porter took on the role of chief investigator, using her nursing background to assess each potential resident's health and life expectancy. She developed a sophisticated system for evaluating candidates considering factors such as their mental state, their family relationships, their financial assets, and their social connections. Only those who met her strict criteria were accepted into the home. Sarah Porter, meanwhile, became an expert in legal matters, studying inheritance laws and probate procedures to ensure that the family's schemes would withstand scrutiny. She established relationships with several Hartford lawyers, presenting herself as a devoted administrator who needed to understand legal procedures to better serve the home's residents. These lawyers unwittingly provided her with the knowledge she needed to create convincing forged documents. The 3 Porters also began to refine their murder methods. Dr. Porter experimented with different drugs and dosages, keeping detailed records of how each substance affected his victims. He discovered that a combination of morphine and laudanum could create symptoms that closely resembled natural sility, while small doses of arsenic could cause gradual organ failure that appeared to be age-related decline. Margaret Porter perfected the art of administering these substances in ways that appeared to be legitimate medical treatment. She developed an elaborate system of false medical records, documenting imaginary symptoms and treatments that would justify the drugs she was actually using to poison her victims. Her nursing credentials gave her actions an air of professional competence that no one questioned. The home's reputation continued to grow throughout the late 1840s and early 1850s. The Porters used their stolen wealth to enhance the facility's amenities, adding a library, a music room, and expanded gardens. They also began hosting elaborate charity events, inviting Hartford's social elite to tour the facility and witness the excellent care being provided to the elderly. These events served multiple purposes. They reinforced the Porters' reputation as devoted Christian caretakers. They provided opportunities to identify wealthy potential victims, and they created a network of influential supporters who would defend the home against any future accusations. Reverend Whitmore became one of their most vocal advocates, regularly praising their work from the pulpit and encouraging his wealthiest parishioners to consider the home for their elderly relatives. But the most chilling aspect of this period was how the Porters began to enjoy their work. The hidden ledgers reveal that they had started rating their victims' deaths based on factors such as the amount of money stolen, the elegance of the murder method, and the convincingness of their performance as grieving caretakers. Dr. Porter wrote detailed critiques of each murder, noting what had worked well and what could be improved in future cases. One particularly disturbing entry from 1849 described the death of Colonel James Hartford, a 68-year-old Revolutionary War veteran who had been slowly poisoned over a period of 6 months. Dr. Porter wrote, "Subject exhibited excellent cooperation during terminal phase. Arsenic dosage created perfect simulation of natural decline. Staff performance exemplary. Margaret's tears during final moments particularly convincing. Inheritance secured 73,500 and overall rating 910. Note: Colonel's military pension ceases upon death. Factor into future calculations. The Porters had transformed murder into abuseness, complete with performance evaluations and profit calculations. They had created a system so efficient and so well disguised that they were able to operate with complete impunity for years. More disturbing still, they had convinced themselves that their crimes were justified by their religious mission, viewing each murder as a necessary sacrifice to fund their Christian charity. By 1850, the Sunset Years Christian Home had become one of Hartford's most respected institutions. The Porters were pillars of the community, regular attendees at First Church of Christ, and generous contributors to local charities. They'd successfully created a public image that was the complete opposite of their private reality. But their success was also creating new challenges. The steady stream of deaths at the home was beginning to attract attention from some quarters. Dr. Samuel Harrison, Hartford's coroner, had begun to notice that an unusually high number of death certificates were being signed by Dr. Porter. While individual cases appeared normal, the overall pattern was starting to seem suspicious. Harrison's concerns were compounded by a troubling conversation he had with Father Patrick O'Brien, the local Catholic priest. O'Brien had mentioned that several families had contacted him about their elderly relatives who had died at the Sunset Years Christian Home. These families had been surprised to learn that their relatives had supposedly converted to Protestantism shortly before their deaths and had changed their wills to reflect their new religious convictions. The priest's observations were particularly significant because they suggested that the Porters might be targeting Catholic residents, specifically using religious conversion as a cover for changing their victims' wills. This added a sectarian dimension to their crimes that could potentially create serious problems if it became public knowledge. Dr. Harrison decided to investigate more carefully, but his efforts were hampered by the Porters' reputation and political connections. When he approached the city authorities with his concerns, he was told that the home was one of Hartford's most valuable institutions and that any investigation would need to be handled with extreme discretion. The Porters, meanwhile, had learned of Dr. Harrison's interest through their network of supporters. They began to take additional precautions, spreading their victims' deaths over longer periods and varying their methods to avoid creating obvious patterns. They also began to cultivate Dr. Harrison directly, inviting him to tour the facility and praising his dedication to public health. By 1851, the Porters had successfully neutralized the threat posed by Dr. Harrison's investigation. They had convinced him that the high number of deaths at their facility was simply the result of their willingness to accept elderly residents that other institutions wouldn't take. Harrison's concerns were dismissed by city officials who valued the home's contribution to the community more than they valued the coroner's suspicions. The Porters had survived their first serious challenge, but the experience had taught them that their crimes were not entirely without risk. They began to develop even more sophisticated methods of concealment, including the creation of false medical records that would justify their victims' deaths and the establishment of a network of corrupt officials who would protect them from future investigations. What none of them realized was that their meticulous record-keeping would eventually become the instrument of their exposure. The ledgers that Dr. Reporter kept hidden beneath the floorboards contained enough evidence to convict them of every single murder they had committed. But for now, those ledgers remained safely hidden, and the Porters continued their deadly work with complete confidence in their ability to evade justice. The shadows of the past were growing longer, but the full darkness of their crimes was still hidden from the world. Hartford's most respected Christian charity was actually a chamber of horrors, and the community's most beloved caretakers were systematic killers who had turned murder into a profitable business model. The year 1853 brought an unexpected challenge to the Porters' carefully orchestrated operation, one that would test their skills in ways they had never anticipated. It began with the arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 71-year-old widow whose circumstances seemed perfect for their purposes. She was wealthy, alone, and suffering from early stages of dementia that made her an ideal candidate for their systematic exploitation. Mrs. Whitfield had been the wife of a prominent Boston banker, and her estate was valued at over $200,000, by far the largest inheritance the Porters had ever targeted. Her only living relative was a nephew in San Francisco who had visited her perhaps twice in the past decade. She had been referred to the Sunset Years Christian Home by her longtime physician, Dr. Marcus Fleming, who had grown too old to continue caring for her complex medical needs. The Porters began their usual routine immediately upon her arrival. Dr. Porter conducted extensive interviews about her financial situation. Margaret began documenting imaginary symptoms that would justify her eventual decline, and Sarah started researching the legal requirements for claiming her inheritance. Everything appeared to be proceeding normally until they discovered something that changed everything. Mrs. Whitfield, despite her dementia, had an unusual habit of writing detailed letters to herself, a coping mechanism she had developed to deal with her memory loss. She would write about her daily activities, her thoughts, and her concerns, then read these letters the next day to remind herself of what had happened. The Porters initially viewed this as simply another symptom of her mental decline, but they soon realized that these letters contained detailed observations about the home's operations. In one particularly troubling entry, Mrs. Whitfield had written, "The medicine Dr. Porter gives me makes me feel very strange. I sleep too much and cannot think clearly. Margaret seems kind, but I have noticed that she watches me very carefully when I take the medicine. I have seen her giving the same medicine to other residents, and several of them have died recently. I wonder if there is a connection." The discovery of these letters created a crisis for the Porters. They had always been careful to ensure that their victims were too incapacitated to understand what was happening to them, but Mrs. Whitfield's letters suggested that she was more aware of her surroundings than they had realized. Worse still, she was documenting her observations in writing, creating a potential record of their crimes. Dr. Porter made the decision to accelerate Mrs. Whitfield's murder timeline, but this created new problems. The rapid increase in her morphine dosage caused her to become violently ill with symptoms that were clearly the result of drug poisoning rather than natural decline. The other residents noticed her sudden deterioration, and several staff members began asking questions about her treatment. Margaret Porter found herself in the difficult position of having to explain Mrs. Whitfield's condition to concerned staff members while simultaneously administering the drugs that were causing her illness. She claimed that Mrs. Whitfield was suffering from a rare form of dementia that caused sudden violent episodes, and that the medications were necessary to prevent her from harming herself or others. But the staff's concerns were compounded by another troubling development. Mrs. Whitfield's original physician, Dr. Fleming, had decided to pay a surprise visit to check on her condition. He arrived on a day when Mrs. Whitfield was heavily sedated and barely conscious, a state that he immediately recognized as being inconsistent with her previous diagnosis. Dr. Fleming's medical examination revealed several alarming symptoms: severe dehydration, dilated pupils, and a rapid irregular heartbeat that suggested drug intoxication rather than natural illness. When he questioned Dr. Porter about Mrs. Whitfield's treatment, he was told that her condition had deteriorated rapidly and that aggressive medication was necessary to control her symptoms. The visiting physician was not convinced by Dr. Porter's explanation. He had treated Mrs. Whitfield for years and had never observed the violent episodes that Dr. Porter described. Moreover, her current symptoms were inconsistent with the progression of dementia and suggested the presence of external factors that were causing her decline. Dr. Fleming insisted on reviewing Mrs. Whitfield's medical records, which created a new crisis for the Porters. The records that Margaret had created were designed to justify her murder, but they contained inconsistencies and fabrications that would not withstand scrutiny by an experienced physician. The Porters found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to defend their medical decisions to a colleague who had superior knowledge of their victim's actual condition. The confrontation between the two physicians took place in Dr. Porter's office with Margaret and Sarah present as witnesses. Dr. Fleming systematically challenged every aspect of Mrs. Whitfield's treatment, pointing out inconsistencies in the medical records and questioning the appropriateness of the medications being used. He demanded to know why Mrs. Whitfield had been given such large doses of morphine and why her family had not been notified of her deteriorating condition. Dr. Porter responded with a masterful performance of professional indignation. He claimed that Dr. Fleming was questioning his competence based on outdated medical knowledge and that the treatments being used represented the latest advances in geriatric medicine. He pointed out that Mrs. Whitfield had been entrusted to his care by her family and that he had a legal and moral obligation to make treatment decisions based on his professional judgment. The argument continued for over an hour with both physicians, citing medical literature and case studies to support their positions. Dr. Fleming insisted that Mrs. Whitfield's symptoms were inconsistent with natural disease progression, while Dr. Porter maintained that her condition was the result of rapid dementia complicated by age-related organ failure. Eventually, Dr. Porter played what he considered to be his trump card. He revealed that Mrs. Whitfield had expressed a desire to die peacefully and had asked him to ensure that her suffering would be minimized. He claimed that the morphine was being administered not as a cure but as palliative care to ease her transition to the next life. This explanation fit perfectly with the Christian mission of the home and made it difficult for Dr. Fleming to continue his objections without appearing to be heartless. Dr. Fleming was forced to accept Dr. Porter's explanation, but he made it clear that he would be monitoring Mrs. Whitfield's condition closely. He arranged to visit her twice weekly and insisted on receiving detailed reports about her treatment. This level of scrutiny was unprecedented in the Porters' experience and created significant complications for their operation. The Porters realized that they could not continue with their original plan to murder Mrs. Whitfield. While Dr. Fleming was monitoring her condition, they were forced to reduce her morphine dosage and allow her to recover somewhat while frantically searching for a way to eliminate the threat posed by the visiting physician. Sarah Porter proposed a solution that demonstrated the depths of their depravity. She suggested that they should arrange for Dr. Fleming to have an accident that would prevent him from continuing his visits. She had researched his daily routines and discovered that he walked alone to his office each morning along a route that passed through a construction site. It would be relatively easy to arrange for him to be struck by falling debris or to suffer a fall that would incapacitate him. The proposal to murder Dr. Fleming marked a new phase in the Porters' criminal evolution. They had moved beyond killing isolated elderly residents to considering the murder of a respected physician who posed a threat to their operation. The fact that they could contemplate such an action demonstrated how completely they had abandoned any pretense of moral restraint. Dr. Porter ultimately rejected Sarah's proposal, not because he was opposed to murdering Dr. Fleming, but because he believed the risks were too great. The death of a prominent physician would attract far more attention than the deaths of elderly residents, and there was a significant chance that an investigation would uncover their crimes. Instead, he proposed a different solution. They would allow Mrs. Whitfield to recover enough to satisfy Dr. Fleming's concerns, then find a way to discredit his medical judgment. The porter's solution was both elegant and ruthless. They gradually reduced Mrs. Whitfield's morphine dosage, while simultaneously introducing small amounts of a different drug that would cause symptoms resembling heart disease. When Dr. Fleming arrived for his next visit, he found Mrs. Whitfield in significantly better condition, with her previous symptoms having been replaced by what appeared to be cardiac irregularities. Dr. Porter explained that Mrs. Whitfield's improvement was the result of adjusting her medications based on Dr. Fleming's recommendations. He claimed that the cardiac symptoms were a new development that required immediate attention and that he had already begun treatment with digitalis, a standard medication for heart conditions. The explanation was medically plausible and demonstrated that Dr. Porter had taken Dr. Fleming's concerns seriously. Dr. Fleming was satisfied with Mrs. Whitfield's improvement and praised Dr. Porter for his responsive treatment. He agreed to reduce the frequency of his visits to once weekly, which gave the porters more flexibility in their operations. Most importantly, he had been convinced that his initial concerns had been unfounded and that Mrs. Whitfield was receiving appropriate care. What Dr. Fleming didn't realize was that the cardiac symptoms were being artificially induced by the porters as part of their new murder plan. The digitalis that Dr. Porter was supposedly using to treat her heart condition was actually being administered in doses that would gradually cause heart failure. The method was slower than their usual morphine overdoses, but it was virtually undetectable and would appear to be the result of natural age-related decline. Mrs. Whitfield died 6 weeks later of apparent heart failure with Dr. Fleming present to witness her peaceful passing. He signed the death certificate without hesitation, noting that her death was consistent with the cardiac symptoms he had observed during his visits. The porters had successfully murdered their most challenging victim while convincing the investigating physician that they were providing excellent care. The successful elimination of Mrs. Whitfield despite Dr. Fleming's scrutiny gave the porters tremendous confidence in their abilities. They had proven that they could adapt their methods to meet any challenge, and that their skills in deception were sophisticated enough to fool even experienced medical professionals. The $200,000 inheritance that they stole from Mrs. Whitfield's estate was by far their largest single theft, and it provided them with the resources to expand their operations even further. But the Mrs. Whitfield case also revealed something troubling about the porters' psychological state. The hidden ledgers show that they had begun to take pride in the complexity of their crimes and the sophistication of their deceptions. Dr. Porter wrote extensive analyses of each challenge they faced and the methods they used to overcome them, treating their murders as intellectual puzzles rather than acts of violence. The transformation of the porters from opportunistic killers to sophisticated criminal masterminds was complete. They had developed the skills, the resources, and the psychological detachment necessary to continue their crimes indefinitely. What they didn't realize was that their very success was creating the conditions that would eventually lead to their exposure. By 1865, the porters had been operating their murderous enterprise for 20 years, and their success had made them increasingly bold and careless. The end of the Civil War had brought new opportunities as veterans returned to Hartford with war-related injuries and pensions, creating a fresh population of vulnerable elderly residents. The porters saw these men as particularly valuable targets because their military service had earned them community respect, making their deaths less likely to be questioned. It was during this period that they encountered Captain Ezra Blackwood, a 62-year-old Union Army veteran who had been severely wounded at Gettysburg. Captain Blackwood had lost his left arm in the battle, and shrapnel wounds had left him with chronic pain that required regular medical attention. He had been awarded a substantial military pension, and his years of service had earned him a sizable savings account. More importantly, he had no living family and few social connections, making him an ideal candidate for the porter's scheme. But Captain Blackwood was different from their previous victims in ways that the porters failed to recognize. His military experience had made him naturally suspicious of authority figures, and his years of command had taught him to observe details that others might miss. From his first day at the Sunset Years Christian Home, he began to notice patterns in the facility's operations that troubled him. Captain Blackwood observed that several residents had experienced rapid declines in their health shortly after arriving at the home. He noticed that Dr. Porter spent an unusual amount of time discussing financial matters with residents, and that Margaret Porter seemed to administer medications more frequently than seemed medically necessary. Most disturbing of all, he realized that the home's mortality rate was significantly higher than would be expected for a facility of its size and reputation. The captain's military training had taught him the importance of gathering intelligence before taking action. He began to conduct his own investigation, carefully documenting his observations and quietly questioning other residents about their experiences. What he discovered convinced him that something criminal was happening at the home, though he was not yet certain about the full scope of the Porters' activities. Captain Blackwood's investigation was complicated by the fact that he was beginning to experience symptoms that he suspected were caused by his medications. Dr. Porter had prescribed laudanum for his chronic pain, but the captain noticed that the drug was making him increasingly confused and disoriented. He began to suspect that he was being deliberately drugged, and he started to hide his medications instead of taking them. The captain's refusal to take his prescribed medications created problems for the Porters. Without the drugs to incapacitate him, he remained alert and suspicious, making it impossible for them to proceed with their usual murder method. Dr. Porter attempted to convince him that the medications were necessary for his health, but Captain Blackwood insisted that he felt better without them. The situation became more complicated when Captain Blackwood began to share his suspicions with other residents. He carefully selected individuals who seemed trustworthy and mentally alert, gradually building a network of allies who could help him investigate the home's operations. The Porters realized that they were facing their most serious threat yet, an organized resistance movement among their intended victims. Margaret Porter discovered the extent of Captain Blackwood's activities when she intercepted a letter he had written to his former commanding officer. In the letter, the captain described his suspicions about the home's operations and requested assistance in investigating possible criminal activity. He mentioned specific residents who had died under suspicious circumstances and provided details about the medications being administered taurucidants. The letter represented a potential catastrophe for the Porters. If Captain Blackwood's former commanding officer took his concerns seriously and contacted authorities, it could trigger the investigation that they had managed to avoid for 20 years. The letter also revealed that the captain had been gathering evidence systematically, suggesting that he possessed information that could expose their crimes. Dr. Porter realized that Captain Blackwood had to be eliminated immediately, but the circumstances made their usual methods impractical. The captain was too alert to be easily poisoned, and his suspicious nature made it impossible to convince him to take medications voluntarily. Moreover, his military background meant that his sudden death would likely attract attention from Army investigators, who would be more thorough than local authorities. The Porters decided to use a method they had never attempted before. They would stage an accident that would eliminate Captain Blackwood, while making his death appear to be the result of his war injuries. Sarah Porter proposed that they could arrange for the captain to fall down the home's main staircase, claiming that his missing arm had caused him to lose his balance. The fall would be blamed on his disability, and his death would be viewed as a tragic accident rather than a murder. The plan required careful timing and coordination. The Porters waited until a stormy night when the home's staff would be distracted by other duties. Dr. Porter approached Captain Blackwood's room with a syringe containing a powerful sedative, intending to incapacitate him before staging the fall, but the captain was prepared for such an attack. When Dr. Porter entered his room, Captain Blackwood was waiting behind the door with a walking stick raised as a weapon. The two men struggled briefly with the captain using his military training to overcome the doctor's attempt to inject him with the sedative. The fight ended when Captain Blackwood struck Dr. Porter with the walking stick, causing him to drop the syringe and flee the room. The failed attack confirmed Captain Blackwood's worst suspicions about the Porter's intentions. He realized that his life was in immediate danger and that he needed to escape from the home before they could make another attempt on his life. But the captain also understood that simply fleeing would not solve the problem. The Porters would continue killing other residents unless someone stopped them. Captain Blackwood made a decision that would prove to be both courageous and fatal. Instead of escaping immediately, he chose to remain at the home long enough to gather the evidence needed to expose the Porters' crimes. He knew that his accusations alone would not be sufficient to convince authorities, especially given the Porters' reputation in the community. He needed proof that would be impossible. To dismiss or explain away the captain's plan was to obtain samples of the medications being administered to residents and to document the porter's methods in sufficient detail to support criminal charges. He used his military skills to move through the home undetected, searching offices and medical supply rooms for evidence of the poisoning operation. What he discovered exceeded even his worst fears. In Dr. Porter's private office, hidden behind medical texts, Captain Blackwood found vials of morphine, arsenic, and other deadly substances that had no legitimate medical purpose in a home for the elderly. He also discovered forged documents, including blank wills and death certificates that could be used to steal residents' inheritances. Most damning of all, he found a partial list of residents who had died at the home, along with notations about the amounts of money inherited by the facility. Captain Blackwood carefully documented his findings, creating detailed notes about each piece of evidence and its location within the home. He planned to present this information to military authorities who would have the power to conduct a thorough investigation. But as he prepared to leave the home with his evidence, the Porters discovered what he had been doing. Sarah Porter found the captain in Dr. Porter's office just as he was photographing the incriminating documents with a small camera he had obtained for intelligence-gathering purposes. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything the Porters had experienced before. Captain Blackwood did not attempt to deny his activities or to negotiate for his safety. Instead, he calmly informed Sarah that he had already sent copies of his evidence to military authorities and that his death would only confirm their worst suspicions. Sarah Porter realized that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. The Porters were no longer dealing with isolated elderly victims who could be eliminated quietly. They were facing a trained military investigator who had systematically documented their crimes and had taken steps to ensure that his evidence would survive his death. For the first time in 20 years, the Porters faced the real possibility of exposure and prosecution. The crisis deepened when Dr. Porter returned to his office and discovered the confrontation between Sarah and Captain Blackwood. The captain's calm demeanor and obvious preparation convinced the doctor that their situation was far more serious than he had initially realized. The evidence that the captain had gathered was comprehensive enough to destroy them, and his claims about having contacted military authorities could not be dismissed as bluffing. Dr. Porter made a desperate decision that revealed how completely the 20 years of murder had corrupted his judgment. Instead of attempting to negotiate with Captain Blackwood or to flee before authorities arrived, he chose to eliminate the threat by committing the most brazen murder of his career. He retrieved a pistol from his desk drawer and shot Captain Blackwood 3 times in the chest, killing him instantly. The gunshots were heard throughout the home, creating immediate chaos among residents and staff. Margaret Porter arrived within minutes, followed by several terrified residents who demanded to know what had happened. Dr. Porter attempted to claim that Captain Blackwood had attacked him and that the shooting had been in self-defense. But this explanation was contradicted by the evidence in the room. The presence of the incriminating documents, the camera, and Captain Blackwood's detailed notes made it impossible to present his death as anything other than murder. Moreover, the captain's body showed no signs of having attacked anyone, and the gun had been fired from close range in a manner consistent with execution rather than self-defense. The Porters had finally committed a crime that could not be explained away or covered up. The immediate aftermath of Captain Blackwood's murder marked the beginning of the end for the Porters' criminal empire. The gunshots had been heard by neighbors, and within hours, Hartford police arrived at the home to investigate reports of violence. The Porters attempted to maintain their facade of respectability, claiming that the shooting had been a tragic accident involving a disturbed veteran who had suffered from war-related mental illness. But the police investigation quickly revealed inconsistencies in their story. Captain Blackwood's evidence was discovered in Dr. Porter's office, along with the weapons and forged documents that proved the existence of a systematic murder operation. The captain's detailed notes provided investigators with a roadmap for uncovering 20 years of crimes that had been hidden behind a facade of Christian charity. The discovery of Captain Blackwood's evidence triggered the most extensive criminal investigation in Hartford's history. Police searched the entire facility, discovering hidden caches of poison, forged documents, and financial records that documented the theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars from murdered residents. The investigation also revealed the existence of the hidden ledgers that contained Dr. Porter's detailed records of each murder. As word of the investigation spread through Hartford, families began to come forward with questions about relatives who had died at the Sunset Years Christian home. The pattern that emerged was consistent with Captain Blackwood's findings. Dozens of wealthy, isolated elderly individuals had died under suspicious circumstances, and their inheritances had been stolen through forged documents. The Porters' arrest on charges of multiple murder and fraud marked the end of one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. But even as they faced prosecution, they continued to maintain their innocence, claiming that they had been devoted Christian caretakers who had been victimized by a disturbed military veteran with paranoid delusions. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Hartford intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. As the full scope of the Porters' crimes finally comes to light, the trial of Dr. William Porter, Margaret Porter, and Sarah Porter began on October 15, 1879, what the Hartford Courant called the most sensational criminal proceeding in Connecticut's history. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and family members of the Porters' victims, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled outrage that threatened to erupt into violence at any moment. Prosecutor James Mitchell had spent months preparing his case, using Captain Blackwood's evidence as the foundation for charges that included 189 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution's case was built around three key pieces of evidence: the hidden ledgers that documented each murder, the physical evidence of poisons and forged documents found in the home, and the testimony of surviving staff members who'd witnessed suspicious activities. The ledgers proved to be the most damning evidence against the Porters. Dr. Porter's meticulous record-keeping had created an incredibly detailed confession that documented not only the methods used to murder each victim, but also the financial calculations that had motivated each crime. The ledgers contained entries such as Mrs. Sarah Caldwell, arsenic administered over 6 weeks, symptoms consistent with natural decline, will forged successfully, inheritance $67,400, total time investment 8 weeks, profit per week $8,125, excellent return on effort. The clinical detachment revealed in these entries shocked even experienced court observers. The Porters had not only murdered their victims systematically, but they had treated each murder as a business transaction, complete with cost-benefit analyses and performance evaluations. The ledgers revealed that they had developed elaborate rating systems for their crimes, judging each murder based on factors such as profitability, difficulty, and the quality of their deceptive performance. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that the Porters had taken pleasure in their work. Dr. Porter's entries frequently included personal observations about their victims' suffering, with comments such as "subject exhibited amusing confusion during final days." Margaret's performance as grieving caretaker particularly convincing during last visits from family. Note: tears on command remain an excellent technique for deflecting suspicion. The prosecution also presented testimony from Dr. Samuel Harrison, the coroner, who had been suspicious of the home's high mortality rate years earlier. Dr. Harrison testified about his attempts to investigate the facility and how the Porters had successfully deflected his concerns through their political connections and community reputation. His testimony revealed that the Porters' crimes could have been stopped much earlier if authorities had been willing to investigate their suspicions more thoroughly. Staff members who had worked at the home provided crucial testimony about the Porters' methods. Nurse Elizabeth Hartwell testified that she had noticed Margaret Porter administering medications to residents at unusual times and in doses that seemed excessive for their conditions. She also testified about overhearing conversations between the three Porters about residents' financial situations and their lack of family connections. Groundskeeper Thomas Murphy provided testimony about strange activities he'd observed on the home's property. He described seeing the Porters burying objects in the gardens late at night, and he testified about finding burned documents in the facility's furnace that appeared to be legal papers. His testimony helped establish that the Porters had been systematically destroying evidence of their crimes for years. The defense team, led by prominent Hartford attorney Charles Whitman, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against the Porters was overwhelming, and their clients' own records provided detailed confessions to every crime they were accused of committing. Whitman's strategy was to argue that the porters had been driven insane by their religious fanaticism and that their crimes were the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent. Whitman presented expert testimony from alienists who claimed that the porters suffered from a form of religious mania that had distorted their moral judgment. The defense argued that the three defendants genuinely believed that they were performing God's work by ending the suffering of elderly residents and using their inheritances to fund Christian charity. According to this theory, the detailed records they kept were evidence of their delusional belief that they were accountable to God for their actions. The insanity defense required the porters to admit that they'd committed the murders, which created dramatic moments in the courtroom when each defendant was forced to acknowledge their crimes. Dr. Porter testified that he had killed residents because he believed God had called him to end their suffering and to use their wealth for righteous purposes. His testimony was chilling in its calm rationality as he explained his methods and motivations without showing any sign of remorse or recognition that his actions had been wrong. Margaret Porter's testimony was even more disturbing. She described the murders as acts of mercy, claiming that she had felt divinely inspired when administering the fatal doses of poison to her victims. She testified that she had prayed over each victim as they died, asking God to forgive them for their sins and to welcome them into eternal rest. Her complete lack of recognition that she had committed crimes shocked even the defense attorneys. Sarah Porter's testimony revealed the calculating nature of their operation. She admitted to forging wills and stealing inheritances, but claimed that she had been following God's will in redirecting wealth from selfish individuals to charitable purposes. She testified about the research she had conducted into victims' financial situations and family relationships, describing these activities as part of her divine mission to identify suitable candidates for merciful release. The prosecution's cross-examination of the defendants exposed the flaws in the insanity defense. Prosecutor Mitchell demonstrated that the porters' actions had been carefully planned and executed with full awareness of their illegal nature. He pointed to their efforts to avoid detection, their destruction of evidence, and their attempts to manipulate investigations as proof that they had understood the criminal nature of their actions. The most damaging evidence against the insanity defense came from the ledgers themselves. The detailed financial calculations and performance evaluations proved that the porters had been motivated by greed rather than religious delusion. The clinical nature of their record-keeping demonstrated that they had approached their crimes as a business enterprise rather than as acts of religious devotion. Mitchell also presented evidence that the porters had lived luxuriously on their stolen wealth, using their victims' money to purchase expensive clothing, jewelry, and furnishings for their private quarters. This evidence contradicted their claims that they had stolen inheritances solely to fund charitable activities, proving that they had been motivated by personal greed. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Mitchell read aloud from Dr. Porter's final ledger entry, written just days before Captain Blackwood's murder. 20 years of successful operations have proven the viability of our method. We have perfected the art of profitable death, combining religious respectability with systematic exploitation. Our victims die believing they are loved while we acquire the wealth to expand our sacred mission. God has blessed our work with remarkable success, and we are prepared to continue indefinitely. Note, consider expansion to other cities. Hartford market becoming saturated. The reading of this entry created an uproar in the courtroom, with family members of victims shouting accusations at the defendants and demanding immediate justice. Judge Morrison was forced to call multiple recesses to restore order, and he threatened to clear the courtroom if spectators could not control their emotions. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all 3 defendants. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the horror that the community felt about the porters' crimes. When the verdicts were read, the defendants showed no emotion, maintaining the same cold detachment that had characterized their crimes. Judge Morrison sentenced each of the defendants to death by hanging, describing their crimes as the most heinous and calculated murders in the history of this state. He noted that their abuse of their positions as trusted caretakers had made their crimes particularly despicable, and he expressed his hope that their execution would serve as a warning to others who might consider similar crimes. The judge's sentencing statement included a scathing condemnation of the porters' attempt to justify their crimes through religious delusion. "You have blasphemed against the very faith you claim to serve. using the sacred trust placed in you by this Christian community to commit acts of unparalleled evil. Your crimes have not only taken the lives of innocent victims, but have shaken the faith of all who believed in the sanctity of Christian charity. The revelation of the Porters' true motivations had exposed the complete contradiction between their public image and their private reality. They had spent 20 years building reputations as devoted Christian caretakers, while simultaneously operating the most successful murder enterprise in American history. Their ability to maintain this deception for so long had required not only criminal skill, but also a level of psychological manipulation that stunned even experienced investigators. The trial had revealed that the Sunset Years Christian home had been a carefully constructed facade designed to provide cover for systematic murder and theft. Every aspect of the facility's operations, from its religious mission to its charitable activities, had been calculated to create an environment where wealthy elderly residents could be exploited and killed without arousing suspicion. The Porters' crimes had succeeded for so long because they had understood that Americans' respect for Christian charity would make them reluctant to investigate accusations against religious institutions. They had exploited the community's faith and trust to create the perfect environment for their criminal enterprise, proving that even the most sacred institutions could be corrupted by human greed and evil. As the defendants were led away to await execution, the full scope of their crimes was still being uncovered. Investigators had identified 189 confirmed victims, but they suspected that the actual number might be higher. The financial damage was estimated at over $3 million, making the Porters' operation one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in American history. The trial of the Porter family had exposed not only their individual crimes, but also the systemic failures that had allowed them to operate with impunity for 20 years. The case would lead to significant reforms in the oversight of charitable institutions and would create new legal requirements for the investigation of suspicious deaths in care facilities. The executions of Dr. William Porter, Margaret Porter, and Sarah Porter took place on December 15, 1879, in the courtyard of the Hartford County Jail. Despite the early morning hour, hundreds of spectators gathered outside the jail to witness the final chapter of what newspapers had dubbed the Christian home murders. The three defendants maintained their composure to the end, with Dr. Porter delivering a final statement that shocked observers with its complete lack of remorse. "We have served God faithfully," Dr. Porter declared from the gallows, "and we go to our reward knowing that our work has been misunderstood by those who lack the vision to see divine purpose in earthly suffering. The money we acquired was used for Christian purposes, and the deaths we administered were merciful releases from the pain of earthly existence. History will vindicate our actions when mankind evolves to understand true Christian charity." Margaret Porter's final words were equally chilling. "I have eased the suffering of 189 souls and guided them gently into God's embrace. Each death was an act of love performed with prayer and compassion. I regret only that we were prevented from continuing our sacred mission to help more elderly souls find peace." Sarah Porter remained silent until the moment before the trap door opened, when she whispered a prayer that was heard by the attending minister. "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They have stopped your servants from performing your work, but your will shall be done through others who understand true mercy." The executions were carried out simultaneously at exactly 7 a.m., with all three defendants dying quickly and without struggle. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in Hartford's Potter's Field, as no cemetery would accept them and no religious denomination would claim them. The city wanted no monuments to their crimes, no shrines where the curious or the disturbed might come to pay homage to their twisted legacy. The investigation into the Porters' crimes continued for months after their execution, as authorities worked to identify all of their victims and to return stolen property to surviving family members. The process was complicated by the Porters' sophisticated methods of concealment and the passage of time since many of the murders had been committed. Ultimately, investigators confirmed 189 murders and identified an additional 23 suspicious deaths that could not be definitively proven to be homicides. The financial investigation revealed that the Porters had stolen approximately $3.2 million from their victims, an enormous sum that would be equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in modern currency. Most of this money had been spent on expanding and maintaining the Sunset Years Christian home, but significant amounts had also been used to purchase luxury items for the Porters' personal use and to make donations to religious organizations throughout Connecticut. The discovery that respected churches had unknowingly accepted donations funded by murder money created a crisis of conscience for Hartford's religious community. Several congregations returned donations they had received from the Porters, while others struggled with the ethical implications of using tainted money for charitable purposes. The controversy divided the religious community for years and led to new policies requiring detailed documentation of large donations. The Sunset Years. Christian Home itself was demolished in the spring of 1880 after city authorities determined that the building had become too infamous to serve any useful purpose. The property was sold to developers who built modest residences on the site. But for decades afterward, the neighborhood struggled with its association with the murders. Property values remained depressed, and many residents reported feeling uncomfortable living where so many innocent people had died. The Porter case had profound effects on the regulation of care facilities throughout the United States. Connecticut passed the first comprehensive laws requiring government oversight of charitable institutions, mandating regular inspections and background checks for operators of care facilities. Other states followed with similar legislation, creating a regulatory framework that continues to govern institutional care today. The case also led to significant changes in inheritance law and probate procedures. New requirements were established for witnessing wills, verifying the mental competence of testators, and investigating suspicious bequests to charitable organizations. These reforms made it much more difficult for future criminals to use forged documents to steal inheritances from vulnerable elderly victims. Perhaps most importantly, the Porter case changed public attitudes toward institutional care for the elderly. Families became much more cautious about placing elderly relatives in residential facilities, and communities developed new expectations for transparency and accountability from charitable organizations. The blind trust that had allowed the Porters to operate with impunity for 20 years was replaced by healthy skepticism and demand for oversight. The psychological impact of the Porter case on Hartford's residents was profound and lasting. Many people struggled to reconcile their memories of the Porters as respected community members with the reality of their crimes. Neighbors who had socialized with the family, parishioners who had worshipped alongside them, and community leaders who had praised their charitable work all faced the disturbing realization that they had been completely deceived by master manipulators. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the coroner, who had first suspected that something was wrong at the home, became a prominent advocate for medical ethics and professional accountability. He spent the remainder of his career developing guidelines for investigating suspicious deaths and training other medical professionals to recognize signs of systematic abuse. His work helped ensure that future cases of medical murder would be detected and investigated more quickly. The staff members who had worked at the Sunset Years Christian Home faced their own struggles with guilt and trauma. Many of them had genuinely believed they were working for a charitable organization and were devastated to learn that they'd unknowingly participated in a murder operation. Several former employees required psychological treatment to cope with their experiences, and some never worked in healthcare again. The families of the Porters' victims experienced a complex mix of emotions following the trial and executions. While they found some satisfaction in seeing justice served, many struggled with questions about their elderly relatives' final days and their own failure to recognize the danger their loved ones had faced. Support groups were formed to help these families process their grief and anger, creating some of the first organized victim advocacy efforts in American history. The Porter case also had significant effects on American journalism and true crime literature. The extensive newspaper coverage of the trial established new standards for crime reporting, and the case became one of the first major criminal stories to be covered by correspondents from multiple cities. Books about the case were published within months of the executions, beginning a tradition of true crime literature that continues today. Religious leaders throughout the country used the Porter case as an opportunity to examine the relationship between faith and criminal behavior. Sermons were preached about the dangers of false prophets and the importance of distinguishing between genuine Christian charity and exploitation disguised as religious service. The case became a cautionary tale about the potential for evil to hide behind facades of respectability and religious devotion. The architectural legacy of the case was also significant. The demolition of the Sunset Years Christian Home established a precedent for destroying buildings. Associated with notorious crimes and many other infamous structures were subsequently torn down to prevent them from becoming sites of morbid fascination. This practice reflected society's desire to erase physical reminders of extreme evil and to prevent the glorification of criminal behavior. Modern investigators and historians who've studied the Porter case continue to be amazed by the sophistication and longevity of their criminal operation. The combination of medical knowledge, legal expertise, and psychological manipulation that the Porters employed was remarkably advanced for its time and would be impressive even by contemporary standards. Their ability to maintain their deception for 20 years while committing nearly 200 murders represents one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. The case has also become an important study in criminal psychology, particularly in understanding how seemingly normal individuals can become capable of systematic murder. The Porters' gradual descent into evil, their ability to rationalize their crimes through religious delusion, and their development of increasingly sophisticated methods of concealment provide valuable insights into the criminal mind and the process of moral corruption. This mystery shows us how easily evil can disguise itself behind facades of respectability and religious devotion, and how important it is to question authority and demand accountability from those who claim to serve our communities. The Porter family's crimes remind us that the most dangerous criminals are often those we trust most, and that vigilance is the price of safety in any civilized society. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Porters' operation, or might there have been additional crimes that were never discovered? The meticulous nature of their record-keeping suggests they documented everything, but the possibility remains that some of their earliest victims were never identified. Leave your comment below and share your theories about what other secrets might have died with the Porter family. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe. Hit the notification bell and share with someone who loves mysteries as dark and twisted as this one. The shadows of the past hold many more secrets, and we'll continue to uncover them together. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another tale of hidden evil that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature.